Collection of talks on Nokodemion's teaching. From Contact Reports from 767.
Contact Report 721.
Excuse me, I did not really want to talk about that, but to ask you what you actually got out of all that he taught me regarding the matter of your task of continuing the teaching and mission of Nokodemion. Your daughter Simyase, as well as you and Quetzal, have told me that you are well occupied with the teaching, and also knew that you are included in the lineage of the teaching of Nokodemion, and that you will therefore also be in contact with me. I know from Svath that he only informed you about everything in relation to the closer connections during the last years of his life. But I would now be interested if you could briefly explain to me some closer connections, such as with regard to your lineage back to Nokodemion, etc. Perhaps also some of your father's Svath annals?
The whole thing is rambling, so I will have to go into it in more depth at a later date. What I want to say today relates to the following. About the lineage of our family, which goes back to Nokodemion. It is to be said that my daughters Simyase and Plagia, our relatives, which also include Quetzal, Asket, and Nera, and of course others, are in the obligation to preserve the teaching of Nokodemion, the teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life. This, however, is only the direct teaching, comprising 77 million canons, of which you have made out the OM. But apart from that, there are still many doctrinal parts which are of a completely different nature, as my father listed in his annals, but which were not accessible to him and are also not accessible to us. For this reason, you had to retrieve information from the memory bank of Nokodemion for my father, which was important for him and also for us and is also important for our future. What I'm about to say, however, is not much, and the whole thing relates to the fact that our task of preserving the teachings goes back to a man of our very early ancestors from the line of Nokodemion. More specifically, to a very distant descendant of his 3 sons, whose name was Gilkar Note, meaning of name, the Rectifier, and who undertook to carry on the teaching. From his family line came the commitment of the transmission of the teachings into the farthest future, whereby the ancient teachings of Nokodemion are preserved and taught to this day, and also throughout our very extensive Playaran Federation. Unfortunately, however, it has not been preserved in its entirety, but only in part, which is why my father Svath felt compelled to enlist the help of his father, grandfather and great-grandfather at an early stage, in order to obtain more precise details and instructions for himself and our family regarding our task of preserving and passing on the teachings. He recorded the results of his research in this regard in his very extensive annals, which he himself, however, only gave me access to in the mid-1930s and informed me of the fundamental connections with the teaching of Nokodemion as well as our family lineage and kinship and the task. So it was only then that we found out about the reincarnations of the spirit form of Nokodemion, namely, that it also appeared in several reincarnations on Earth. The beginning of the spirit form of Nokodemion on Earth came about 389,000 years ago, when a Playaran herald from the Nokodemion lineage named Ijum, meaning of the name the Prudent One, came to Earth with 144,000 human beings from the Nokodemion people and settled in the Gobi Desert. However, the teaching that Ijum taught was disregarded, as has been the case since time immemorial and always, which is why there were always only a few who opened their ears to the efforts of the Annunciator. The majority of the masses, therefore, did not care for the teaching brought by the herald, but in their delusion of faith continued to follow their gods, which equally led to differences and disputes among the various faith groups, as has always been the case, even in later times, and has remained so to this day among all the delusional believers in religion on Earth. At that time, However, after only a short time, the hostilities among the immigrants broke out to such an extent that the city built in the desert and the other populated areas, as well as the earth, had to be abandoned. More than 25,000 years ago, new Plei-Aran immigrants arrived on Earth with a slightly yellowish skin pigmentation and mixed with already existing earthly human forms, resulting in another human species that migrated to a large island. The original immigrants, who came from our Ankar universe more than 25,000 years ago, had created a dimensional gateway millions of light years beyond the Milky Way galaxy, and so entered the Dern universe and from there to Earth, where they settled in fertile areas that are now all part of China. What happened about 389,000 years ago, after only a third of a century, then quickly led to the termination of the action and the abandonment of Earth, after which their distant descendants many generations later, about 13,500 years ago, once again formed an Earth immigrant community and came to Earth. These settled east and south in various places in the areas bordering the Mediterranean Sea and sought a new beginning. This, then, was after another ancient Pleiadian emigrant community had migrated and settled in the fertile lands of what is now called China, some 11,500 years earlier. When then, about 13,500 years ago, the up-to-then last Plei-Aran community of immigrants came to Earth, then this happened in a completely secret form, namely because since the time of 389,000 years earlier, other extraterrestrials had come to the Earth in the meantime and had settled down far and wide on all continents, above all the long-skulled ones. In ancient Egypt in particular, they rose to positions of power, waged wars, and subjugated tribes of peoples, such as those who called themselves Ebraya. It was these who, in later times, under the leadership of a Negrid Plei-Aran descendant called Avian, note, meaning of name, he who gives refuge, who was, however, called Avram by the Ebraya, had joined forces about 4,500 years ago with the still few distant descendants of the ancient Plei-Aran immigrants who appeared about 13,500 years ago, and also begat many descendants. From these descendants begotten between Plei-Aran descendants and the Ebraya, a sixfold lineage of termination then emerged, namely from the reincarnation line of Nokodemion, whose spirit form reincarnated several times and in rapid succession among the Ebraya. This was after the then messenger Ijum from the Nokodemion line lost his life in the Gobi Desert during the warfare of the Earth immigrant community about 385,000 years ago, and his spirit form either remained in the earthly realm or migrated and returned, about which unfortunately nothing is known in detail. What is known to us, however, is that the old Plei-Aran immigrants very quickly mixed with the above-mentioned tribes of peoples. But it turned out that this time, too, unpleasant disputes arose, which led to the fact that despite the efforts of the heralds, various of these peoples split up and partly also fell into bondage to other peoples. However, when I speak of those peoples into which the Plei-Aran immigrants integrated themselves, I am not referring to large peoples, but to larger tribes of peoples that did not correspond to complex forms of social organization. The members of these tribes of peoples, which corresponded to a tribal ethnicity, traced back to a common ancestry, which ensured that a certain mutual cohesion was given as a result of kinship. This, however, did not prevent larger national peoples, who could no longer be called tribes of peoples, but real great peoples or state peoples, from forcibly binding smaller tribes of peoples into servitude. This was also partly the case with the tribes of peoples who had settled around the Mediterranean areas and had mixed with the Plei-Aran immigrants at an early stage. who were then forced into servitude in the land of the ruling long-skulled ones. But the same thing happened to the Abrea not only by the rulers in ancient Egypt, but also to their distant descendants by the king of the New Babylonian Empire, Nabuchodonosor, who is also called Nebuchadnezzar II. The proto-tribal leader of the Abrea was a very distant Negrid descendant of a Pleiaren group who had appeared on Earth as immigrants more than 13,500 years ago, who had also mixed with Earth humans, this proto-tribal leader called Avian, living in a land area called Plecht, east of the Mediterranean, with a nomadic tribe of Abrea who called him Avram. The denunciation by 6 heralds with the Nokodemion spirit form took place after the Pleiaren immigration on Earth some 13,500 years ago and lasted until the time of the year 632. The heralds were the following: Enoch, born 3rd February 930-894 before Emmanuel BC, Eliah, born 5th February 891-780 before Emmanuel BC, Jesaja, born 7th February 772-690 before Emmanuel BC, Jeremiah, born 9th February 662-580 before Emmanuel BC, Emmanuel, born 3rd February 2111, 9th May, Muhammad born 19th February 571-632 after Emmanuel AD. They all endeavored to teach the doctrine of Nokodemion not only among the Abrea, but also among various peoples who existed in the regions bordering the Mediterranean to the east and south, as well as in Egypt and on both sides of the Red Sea down to its end. But they also taught far eastward to Mesopotamia, where King Gilgamesh formerly ruled in Uruk-Gart, as well as to the Aryan country. What I still want to explain for today, this refers to the fact that also in the sister creation, the teachings in the Dal universe are taught among the peoples who have migrated from our planets, so also among the people of Ishrish Asket, as also among all Sonair peoples. And the fact that we also brought this teaching to Earth at an early time was due to the fact that our ancestors discovered a natural dimensional gate 22 million years ago by chance, which is located here in the Dern universe about 120 light-years beyond the Pleiades stars known to you. The dimensional gateway was discovered because a moon from our Ankar universe that had drifted from an exploded planet entered the Dern universe through this dimensional gateway, which our ancestors investigated and then found to be Earth's satellite. One consequence of this was that over the course of millions of years, small groups of Pleiaren repeatedly migrated to Earth and also died here. Later, when the first human life forms also developed on Earth around 12 million years ago in various areas that are now Europe, Africa, Asia, North and South America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, China and Russia, as well as various islands, several small groups of our Pleiaren ancestors had also already settled in some areas on the planet, but they all died out in the course of the next millions of years. About 6 million years ago, when the distant descendants of the first human beings moved in a few specimens all over the Earth and had developed more highly over the next 3 million years, more Pleiaren emigrants came to Earth, some of whom joined forces with the original earthly humans and mated with them. As for the further teachings of Nokodemion, which concern the teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, which you have already partly retrieved as a boy for my father Sfath from the memory bank of Nokodemion, he has recorded all this in his annals in handwriting. And what you have been retrieving and elaborating for us for years brings us undreamt of insights and possibilities for the development of consciousness that surpass everything we have known so far and with which we often have trouble understanding everything, which is why the explanatory work you do for us is so significant and very important for us. Unfortunately, however, We can only cope with this if you constantly provide us with the necessary explanations and explanations in your computer, which we can constantly take over and D. That was the case, yes, as our handed-down knowledge shows, but this was concealed in the extremely heavily falsified written folk history of the Abraya, as well as all the facts I have mentioned. In addition, the teaching brought to them of Nokodemion was extensively rejected, and an untrue religious story was invented to the contrary, just as in the same wise was the history of the origin of the Abraya people's tribes and their descendants. Truthfully, the records were only written out many decades after the real events by scribes with their own interpretations, ideas, and fantasies, just as was the case with the 6 proclaimers. In the case of Muhammad, for example, it was more than 100 years after his death before the first words were written about him, and his teaching was completely disregarded and rewritten and replaced by a completely reinvented one. Hence, the true teaching that Muhammad brought, the teaching of the prophets, that is to say, teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, was not simply falsified beyond recognition, but it was, as was already the case with the same teaching of Emmanuel, completely denied and replaced by a new truth-falsified religious history that was fantasized together from the ground up and directed towards a Godhead and spread. In addition, over the course of centuries, new rules, rituals, prayer, behavior, and other regulations as well as religious laws, etc. were invented over and over again, which were consciencelessly fantasized into the irrationally and confusingly invented senseless religious teaching, and were mendaciously ascribed to the proclaimers Emmanuel and Muhammad. You could put it like that, yes. In the course of time, these scripts were of course changed in their form again and again, or put out of use, which is why many of the original types of script only exist as historical remnants, if at all. But what is also to be said about this is the fact that, unfortunately, already very early on, written language was misused by earthly scribes. This happened in particular by literate persons, who recorded historical events in writing, which they themselves nevertheless interpreted inadequately and completely wrongly according to their own and inaccurate observations, as well as very often deluded perceptions as well as imaginations, inadequate, poor memories, and assumptions. This was likewise the case when the scribes were engaged and contracted by the people for the purpose of writing records, while without exception it was the case that the persons capable of script and thus of writing never wrote down exactly what they were assigned to write. As a consequence, it always happened that the human beings who called upon those versed in writing, because they themselves simply were unknowledgeable in writing and therefore of written language, could do nothing other than to explain to the scribes, in their simple language, to put their concerns down in writing, etc. Those capable of writing, then, through their own interpretations, allowed themselves to write down what had been explained and said to them according to their own understanding and their own interpretations. And the reason for this was because those who did not know how to write, who commissioned something to be written, were unable to dictate what they had to say and explain directly into the written language. That is why wrong descriptions and, in some cases, extremely grave wrong interpretations arose as a result of the scribes' own interpretations, which have survived to the present time and are taught in equally wrong forms. Equally, this happened at all times with regard to all religious written records, because only one person, and apart from that one person, not a single person to whom the written traditions are ascribed was knowledgeable of the script and the written language. Consequently, they all had their statements written down by those well versed in writing and the written language, who formulated everything according to their own writing abilities and also wrote everything down via their own interpretations and assumptions, etc. This was also the case with all the major and minor religions and their sects, thus also with Islam and Christianity. After Emmanuel's flight from Jerusalem, his entire life history from birth up to his death was spread and later also written down with monstrous falsifications, lies, assertions, and calumnies. Thus the same happened with Muhammad, whose real name indeed was Abdul Qasim Muhammad ibn Abdallah. In Emmanuel's case, only Judas Iscarioth was well versed in writing. However, neither any female nor male member of his discipleship, which included more persons than just the 12 listed in the New Testament, which is full of inventions, falsifications, wrong commemorative claims, interpretations, and lies. In addition, the individual chapters, assertions, claims, and recollections, etc. of this work of lies were not written until many years after his flight, by scribes, and moreover were written in a further falsifying wise through their own additional interpretations, and partly also attributed to former disciples, who, however, never took part in such writings, and thus did not provide any information whatsoever, out of which the work of lies called New Testament then arose. For the purpose of rectification, you indeed have also given the various necessary details and explanations, wherethrough he has carried out relevant investigations, but is also how he found out much of the actual truth, and was also able to record it in writing. I must say, however, that it is regrettable that you and Guido had to promise to him, during his lifetime, not to mention his name and his written works, which has extraordinarily good evidence facts. Unfortunately, the man also withholds that of your information made known to him, which should actually be mentioned openly with regard to the entire origin of the history of Emmanuel. If one has a close look at the life history of Muhammad, then it must also be said concerning this, that there is hardly a true word in all that which is supposedly handed down about him. For just as with Emmanuel, all around no one was knowledgeable in writing and written language except his first wife, the widow Chadidsha. She was a member of the highly respected Quraysh tribe and heiress of a caravanserai and a trading business in Mecca. At first, under her matriarchy, Muhammad did various works for her, before they got together and married, after which she appointed him as a business partner. The woman was connected to Muhammad by sincere love and was also able to connect with his teaching, which she held in high regard, although she did not record a single word of his teaching or of his life in writing. The incredibly infamous calumny that Muhammad is said to have fathered several children with this woman corresponds to a lie beyond compare, because the woman was incapable of conception and therefore could not be impregnated by Muhammad. However, since Chadidsha wanted to have children, it was decided in agreement between her and Muhammad to adopt several orphans and to secretly pretend that they were their own. After his wife died, he married Sauda bint Zama as his second wife, with whom, however, he also did not father any descendants, nor with Aisha bint Abi Bakr, who was his third wife, and who, contrary to the slanderous traditions, was neither 6 nor 7 or 9 years old at the time of marriage, but 19 years of age. And the malicious story of slander against her, which is said to have arisen during the campaign against the Banu el-Mustalik in the year 627, is just as much a malicious lie as is the story of the 12 mothers of the believers, which was built up on nothing more than lies and deception. This applies equally to the many lies that Muhammad, in addition to his regular marriage, married a greater number of women and had slaves as concubines. For in fact it was only the 3 wives Chadidsha, Sauda bint Zama and Aisha bint Abi Bakr, whom he had married after the death of Chadidsha, And also these marital bonds remained childless because even with these two women, he was not of the sense to procreate offspring. All the larger numbers of other women who were around him were in no way in any marital connection with him, nor in any kind of relationship of a slavish or concubine-like nature. Rather, they were all well protected in his care and friendship. So long after his death, other women were imputed to him by lies and calumnies of alleged relatives and chroniclers and so forth, and had no truth content whatsoever. This also applies to the veiling of women, as well as to completely different senselessnesses. Maliciously minded ones who were against the spreading of the early wrong Christianity that had emerged centuries earlier, through which the true teaching of the proclaimer Emmanuel was completely falsified, saw in it an opportunity to falsify the teaching of Muhammad as well. So, in his time, they seized the opportunity to falsify his teaching, which was indeed the same as that of Emmanuel, and to spread rules and regulations, just as it was with regard to the teaching of Emmanuel. Just as Emmanuel was not able to defend himself against it, so it also happened with Muhammad, because when both had gone their last way, their ever-identical teaching was abysmally falsified, and new religions were created from it. As a consequence, the believers turned to the new teachings, to which Muhammad and Emmanuel could no longer oppose because of their departure, hence Christianity with the New Testament and Islam with the recitation. That is to say, the Quran completely suppressed the truthful teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life. Ancient Palestine was occupied by the Romans at the time of Emmanuel, and had experienced some increase in prosperity under them, even though the native population was directed by a harsh Jewish and religious-oriented rule, which is why it was opportune for the emerging Christians to devise a story of lies of a resurrection of the crucified Emmanuel and to call him Jesus. This, while southern Arabia was a very backward area at the time of Muhammad, far away from all the cultural and economic centers of the world at that time, where the human beings who were poor suffered great hardship and were only too happy to believe in and fall prey to a new religion of salvation. If the old scrolls writings are examined, which are supposed to come from disciples, direct followers and the like, as well as from direct or indirect descendants, relatives, or from family members of the two proclaimers, then all such alleged written proofs correspond altogether to only sneaky and disingenuous falsifications, wrong memories only partly true, and wrong renditions, as well as very fallible interpretations by the scribes. Truthfully, there is not a single such ancient document which would be directly or semi-directly related to a person who had been in direct or indirect contact with Emmanuel or Muhammad. Claims to the contrary and so-called written documentary evidence proofs correspond to nothing other than falsifications and lies, because in the case of both Emmanuel as well as Muhammad, the first written records were made only years later, after their departure, that is to say, after their death. And this happened according to very inadequate or erroneous memories, but also through conscious false claims and lies, etc., as a result of which glorifications and fairy tales regarding Emmanuel and Muhammad also came about. In addition, various direct and indirect followers were fraudulently, lyingly attributed to the two proclaimers, who in truth, however, had nothing to do with them. Even disciples, followers and relatives as well as friends, etc., versed in writing, were attributed to the two proclaimers Emmanuel and Muhammad at all times, but out of all those mentioned, not a single one was knowledgeable of the script and writing. Judas Iscariot was the only one amongst all who correctly and truthfully mastered the script and who was well versed in writing and a disciple close to Emmanuel. Later he was slandered by falsifiers of writings and by hangers-on just as the name of Jesus was then also imputed to Emmanuel. So it must repeatedly be made clear that everything was the same with Muhammad and Emmanuel, although concerning Emmanuel, it was Judas Iscariot who was well versed in script, writing, and written language, and who made the Chronicles, from which the Talmud then arose through your and the group members' efforts, which in the end had to be correctly translated and revised by our script and language experts, specialists, because the priest Isa Rashid had translated it wrongly according to his Christian deluded belief. This, while all other records concerning the teaching of Emmanuel and Muhammad were in no way made by any of their disciples, or direct or indirect descendants, etc., but by strangers, namely even only a long time after their death. Truthfully, however, in relation to the two of them and their teaching, which on both sides was the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, everything was abysmally misunderstood and boundlessly falsified beyond recognition. This also applies to various other ancient and newly discovered old writings, which likewise do not lead back to any disciples during the lifetime of Emmanuel, or to direct followers or relatives and so forth of Muhammad. To this I can only answer in such a way as I have learned from my father and from you, and to which I think I am trying to explain the whole thing in the way you are wont to do in your saying, because this corresponds to what is evidently necessary in order to instruct Earth humans. For in the course of the last few years we have gained very clear knowledge through observation and study that the earthly human teaching methods for the development of mind, reason, and intellect are extremely defective, as is also the case with the teaching methods in regard to morals, cognition, mentality, ethics, and ethos. In this respect, in all these methods of teaching, the profound mistake is made that every instruction of education and teaching is applied in an inadequate manner. Firstly, by not applying the correct and necessary word values, and secondly, by not applying the necessary verbal volumes, normal, soft, or loud, as the case may be, and thirdly, by not presenting and carrying out the necessary explanations in the necessary details, as you, however, do. Now, as for the values I have mentioned, these mean exactly what you have also interpreted for us Playaran and explained in your teachings. What we have adopted and learned from you in this way, and continue to teach, and which has brought us better knowledge than what has been handed down to us in this respect, which is not in such a detailed way as you teach. Unfortunately, it was and is also no different with us than with Earth humans, that probably since earliest ancient times all important teachings have been recorded in verbal form by means of written characters and technical apparatus, and have always been taught in this way up to the present day, but never in the detail and explanatory manner that is peculiar to you. Furthermore, through your teaching areas written for us, we have been able to acquire new knowledge that would never have been possible for us to gain without your tirelessness in your teaching, because these are facts that are only to be found in the unfathomable memory banks of Nokodemion, to which only you, as the most distant recent personality of his billion-year-old line of descendants, have access, which is just as closed to us as it is to every other life form. It was my father Svath who had delved deeply into the ancient annals handed down to us, as before his father, grandfather and great-grandfather, etc., all the way back into the farthest past, whereby great parts of the spiritual teachings have been preserved over all times of millions and billions of years, and have always been passed on, but only taught in the narrower circle of the Nokodemion lineage to which my family lineage belongs. It was also determined early on that the teaching should also be carried out and spread wherever parts of our peoples who are descendants of the Nokodemion line segregate themselves into other systems. And as a result of the fact that already more than 22 million years ago, parts of the peoples of our very distant ancestors reached the Dern universe of our creation, that is to say, the space-time structure in which the Earth also exists, but also the Tao universe of the twin creation, the teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, was also carried out and spread everywhere there. This was done, and continues to be done, by teachers trained for the purpose, as my father was one, but his task was to teach you, and thus your new personality, from the direct distant descendant line of Nokodemion, and to prepare you for the task ahead. And this task he fulfilled, along with others who taught and prepared for their task the 6 other elders who had already been active before him on Earth, and who each emerged as the new most distant personalities from the line of Nokodemion, but you are the only most distant descendant and elders person who is marked by a faint mark on your body as evidence that your present personality corresponds to the descendant personality of the previous elder's personality. This determination, however, leads back to the level of Arahat Atharsata, because the mark is supposed to prove that your present personality corresponds to the previous personality of the founder, which is supposed to be so because, especially in the Christian world of faith, numerous deceivers have always appeared and fraudulently claimed that they themselves were the reborn previous personality of the founder. But now, dear friend, I will interpret according to your mind the explanations you have given us, if you permit. However, I think you will have to rewrite all the teaching you have written for us for the group members and all the readers of the conversation reports for the sake of their understanding, although I think that what you have done for us will also be of importance for all the Figu associates, etc. It will be as you have said, because on the one hand everything corresponds to how it actually is, as we have recognized since you worked out the teaching of Nokodemion for us, which only you can do, because we have no possibility whatsoever of being able to use his memory banks. And what I have to say now, for that I will ask you to just let me talk. Listen and do nothing else but listen. And so now to the following. Since you have been calling up and working out the teaching material of Nokodemion for us since your youth, for more than 70 years now, this has allowed us to recognize many errors in all our old teachings, whereby we have been able to correct, rectify, and completely renew a great many erroneous things. And to this I will once raise my voice and express my deepest thanks to you, especially myself, as well as in the name of our body and all our peoples, for you have done so much for us, Playaran, from your youthful days until today, tirelessly and so immeasurably, that we stand deeply in our thanks for you, which we offer you in all respect, honor, and dignity, and will also do so in a special way, about which, however, I will remain silent today. Edward, friend, excuse me, words fail me. Edward, even though I am several times older than you in years, please do not say a word about it. You are like such a good and loving second father to me, as was also my father's Svath. And when you will be gone, I will miss you as I still miss him too. Despite the years that have passed since he left, and I want to speak of something else. And that is that it was only through the work you did for us Plearan from early youth, and even more so when you began your mission openly and have since made so much of the teaching of Nokodemion to an extremely extensive degree, that the whole thing finally made all our peoples realize what wrong ways we had gone. It was only through your untiring expositions from the teaching of Nokodemion that we also learned to understand the interrelationships of the real facts of reality and their truth, through which it became possible for us to correct much of what was wrong and also to reshape our attitudes, morals, ethics, and our entire modes of action and behavior in a good, positive, and evolutionary way. Through the teaching of Nokodemion, which is indeed your teaching in the correct manner of his distant line of descendants, we Plyaran have changed, rethought, learnt much, and thereby gained a new future through the teaching you have mentioned. Through the work you have tirelessly done for us since your youth, you have helped all our peoples to progress and make positive changes. And through this, we are able to continue our efforts of our entire mental development in a progressive way, which had found a new beginning through our ancestors more than 52,000 years ago in the earthly calendar, but which only through your untiring work for us, Plyaran now brings all that which makes us true human beings, as you often like to say. But we cannot and must not lose this anymore, which is why we remain in our efforts in this regard and continue to learn.
You shame me, my friend. Because, well, no, let's not talk about that, because there are other things I want to talk about now. But, well, I just want to say that I was not prepared for what you were talking about just now, which I think can certainly stay between us, can't it? But I also do not want to forget to thank you and everyone else for your thanks, although I feel really ashamed, on the one hand because I am not eager to be thanked, and on the other hand because everything you have said seems like praise to me, which I do not want to hear. Moreover, I appreciate the whole thing because with you, the teaching of Nokodemion bears good fruit, while here the earthlings do not care about it, but rebel against it and make terror. Unfortunately, there are only a few who have found the way through understanding and reason and will probably continue to do so, which is very gratifying. However, this does not guarantee that in the foreseeable future the religions and fanatical delusions of God that cause all evil, negative and bad things, wars and terror, as well as the insane further growth of the overpopulation that destroys everything, will come to an end. It will take a long time and a lot of work by Phi-Gu and its core group members, passive members, and fellow Phi-Gu members before a great success will come. Unfortunately, it is also the case that many human beings who actually use the Phi-Gu mission teachings in relation to their own personalities, learn and also make an effort to personally implement what they have learned, do not dare to also pass on and spread everything to the outside world.
This, unfortunately, is as much in accordance with the fact as it is that betrayal of the teaching and of your work is practiced by members who first learn earnestly and strive sternly, but who then, out of thoughtless private airs and foolishness, as you sometimes say, shamefully turn away from everything, betraying the teaching and thus themselves.
What I have to say about the term spirit is that it was not used in antiquity, because it was not created until much later, whereby it was interpreted differently depending on the way of thinking, and is also used today with various meanings. In ancient philosophical terms, the term that is called spirit today was explained as a material, air-like, also fire-like substance, which in further interpretation meant principle of nature and life. Elsewhere, out of religious delusion, the term spirit was and still is referred to as God's Spirit or Holy Spirit. The ancient Greek term pneuma, see above in the Wikipedia excerpt, or as pneuma, was equated in antiquity with the word value breath and air, which at that time also resulted in the terms hagion pneuma, that is to say, holy breath, holy air, as in later times, for example, also the terms pneumology and pneumatics. From this it is clear that in antiquity the term pneuma was associated with completely different values, and that this word concept effectively had no relation whatsoever to the term spirit, and also has no relation whatsoever to it in the present time of the 21st century. The various concepts of the term spirit, such as breath of God, in which the divine spirit of an imaginary God is supposed to work, show, depending on the type and fanaticism of the religious delusion, blatant overlaps ranging from love, harmony, joy, righteousness and a sense of justice to boundless hatred, revenge and retribution, but led much further through insane and confused assumptions, concepts, theories, and imaginings to vicious delusions such as delusions of killing, raping, destroying, torturing, warring, chastising, and murdering, and so on. The Greek ancient word pneuma was, and still is, not only extended to the term spirit, but also put into versions that convey completely wrong ideas and understandings to the human beings. This is how spirit came to have meanings such as pressure, vortex, breeze, and similar concepts, which also led to other terms such as the Hebrew ruas, the Chinese ki, and the Indian prana, or akasha, and to breath soul. Further, pneuma is regarded by the Stoics as a kind of fiery breath of air that is supposed to permeate everything and convey a kind of destiny that is equated with a cosmic might. But also in Christianity, for example in Romans 7:6 EU and Tokyo 3:6 EU, the pneuma is evaluated by Saul or the later Paul as a positive essence of the divine radiance, and thus as its spirit. In the Mediterranean region, especially in Egypt, Greece, and the Roman Empire, the ancient Greek pneuma came into its own in medicine. Because it pulsated through the veins together with the blood, it was on the one hand considered to be the material life force, but was also held responsible for all physiological processes. It was already at the time of Hippocrates, the physician of course, who lived between 460 and 370 BC, that the historically established oath of the physician's vow was taken, which was originally written in Greek, and has been handed down to this day as the Oath of Hippocrates, or Hippocratic Oath, or as the first fundamental formulation of medical ethics. In truth, however, it is still unclear who was actually responsible for the authorship of the oath. Basically, it was the Hippocratic physicians who thought about what the pneuma could be, and where in human beings it could have its seat as a material life force, for which actually only the brain was considered. On the other hand, secular doctors, today called psychologists and psychiatrists or shrinks, assumed that the source of life was in the heart. At that time, when human beings developed illnesses, it was assumed that the pneuma, that is to say the life force or the life source, was hindered by some unhealthy juices. In this respect, the philosopher Aristotle, for example, distinguished between two types of pneuma, namely, on the one hand, the life force that was breathed in from outside and served to maintain the body temperature. On the other hand, he assumed that a pneuma, or corresponding life force, innate to human beings evaporated in the blood, namely in the heart. This is in contrast to the philosopher Straton of Lampsakos, who assumed that human beings become tired and fall asleep, because this is caused by a secretion of the life force, or pneuma. The naturalist Erasistratos assumed, like his teacher Praxagoras of Kos, that there was a vital pneuma in the heart, but also a psychic pneuma in the brain, and he also assumed that there was a psychic pneuma in the blood, in the veins, and in the arteries, as well as in the nerves. So, it is not surprising that pneumatics played a major role in the ancient school of medicine. This was especially true of the natural scientist, anatomist, surgeon, and physiologist Erasistratos, who, together with Hierophilos of Chalcedon and Eudemos of Alexandria, played an important role with regard to the pneuma. What helped him particularly was the fact that he, together with the others, was able to carry out his anatomical studies primarily on human bodies, which he used alive as dissecting objects and of course also killed in the process, all under the protection of the ruler of Alexandria, who supported researchers with regard to their actions. So, Erasistratos in particular was only able to chalk up his research results because he was actually able to dissect human beings, usually prisoners and slaves, alive under the patronage of the ruler. Now, about these early beginnings of medical research, and especially with regard to the cross-dumb false assertions and findings of the philosophers and natural scientists, etc., most of which are still commonplace today in certain sciences, especially in psychology and psychiatry, there would be an infinite amount to report, elaborate, and explain. but that would effectively take us too far. Let us just say that until the early modern era, there were two opposing theories about the seat of the soul or parts of the soul. On the one hand, there was the thesis, dating back to the natural philosophy of Alcmaeon, of Croton and Plato, that the highest and decisive power of the soul is rooted in the human brain. In and of itself, this assumption regarding the highest and decisive power was correct, but infinitely far from the truth, because it was not a question of the power of the soul, but rather of energy of creation, which is known from spiritual theory as the spirit form, which in human beings has its seat in the collicular superior of the brain and which animates consciousness, the thought-feeling psychic world, as well as the entire physical body with a tiny jolter-like energy. So Plato, along with the other three, located the actual source of life in the human being and the brain, even if he, like the others, started from completely false premises due to ignorance, as a result of which he described his doctrine with regard to the various pneumas as separate souls, and regarded them as an immortal part of the brain. This, while the willpower, as he taught, had its place in the breast, and desire its seat in the abdomen. Aristotle, however, was of a different opinion in this respect, for he categorically excluded the seat of the soul organ in the brain, because no direct connection of the brain to the soul faculty could be discerned. Moreover, his false doctrine was that the soul was physically dependent on the warmth of life, which did not apply to the brain because, as he claimed, it was the coldest organ of the body. This was the reason why only the heart, as the warmest part of the body, was the seat of the innate warmth of life in human beings, and therefore also the central organ of all thinking and perceiving functions of the soul. His erroneous view even went so far as to claim that the brain should be understood as nothing more and nothing less than a kind of cold piece of ice, which I found extremely ridiculous. Well, from all these early resulting nonsenses, further nonsenses were also fantasized in the later centuries and 2 millennia by further philosophers and researchers of various kinds, as a result of which, until today, still no real knowledge prevails, especially in the field of psychology and psychiatry. Therefore, the experts in these fields have no comprehensive knowledge of how the processes of thought-feeling psyche formation, as well as the true workings of understanding, reason, intelligence, intellect and intelligentsia take place and what their actual and real functions are. Which also leads to the completely crazy assertion that intelligentsia and intellect are practically one and the same. I have already explained in advance and have so far also given various explanations, namely with regard to the fact that the term spirit is to be understood as something completely different from what is generally understood in the earthly human sense. But I must also explain that many earthly human and indeed also scientific teaching methods are very defective and even wrong, which relate to the manifold evolution of the human beings of the earth. And these wrong teaching methods, which have existed since ancient times, like the associated wrong teachings concerning psychological facts, the values of understanding, reason, intelligentum and intellect, etc. I must correct once and for all and clarify what is correct and what is wrong in this respect. This, however, will certainly cause an uproar among all educated experts in the relevant fields and provoke opposition and attacks against my explanations and statements to the effect that everything is wrong, because everything that has been taught since antiquity by the Greeks, etc., and since then throughout all time, as it is also still taught today, therefore corresponds to correctness. As narrow-minded as the earthlings are with regard to their sciences, they will not acknowledge that the traditional teachings are not correct or only partially correct, although in those early times the human beings of the earth had no actual knowledge of certain sciences, such as psychology, morality, mentality and cognition, etc. The so-called philosophers, too, were not aware of this. Also, the so-called philosophers were not yet advanced enough in their knowledge and understanding of these subjects to be able to survey, understand, and explain the essentials. And I must say this once. If I am to judge certain statements made by early and also later philosophers who are still active today, then many of these philosophical statements are nothing but childish, and so ill-considered that they can only be described as ridiculous. Many of the false teachings and teaching methods have been used since time immemorial, not only by parents and other educators, but mainly by so-called higher or highly educated professionals and scientists, with or without academic titles, with regard to teaching, learning, and with regard to the formation of understanding, reason, intelligence, and intellect. Intelligentum, that is to say, being intelligent, as well as morality, mentality, cognitivity, that is to say, cognition, ethics, and ethos. For this reason, us humans can never achieve what they need to learn with regard to the development of intellect, reason and intellect, as well as with regard to correct morality, mentality, cognition, and a righteous way of life, etc., in order to be human beings in the truest sense of the word, beings with an attitude of consciousness in accordance with creation. But for this it is inevitable and necessary to first explain some specific terminology, as well as some of the fundamental interrelationships, whereby it must first be made clear that experts, academic title bearers, and philosophers of various kinds will raise an insulting veto and a know-it-all attitude that is unparalleled. This is because, in spite of their examinations, such as dissertations, disputations, and rigoroses, they are educated to a certain extent according to their effective ignorance, but nevertheless in truth have only a fragmentary knowledge of their learned matter. That the entire earthly science of psychology proceeds in practically all respects from completely false presuppositions was explained to me by Svarth as early as the 1940s, and he taught me very thoroughly and also very extensively with regard to psychology, as well as the intellect, reason, intelligence and intellect, intelligentum and intelligentsein, and so on. Through this I have come to realize how inadequate and ignorant also in these relations the earthly sciences really are and possess as good as no real knowledge. With regard to intelligence, the greatest mistake is revealed, because it is placed in direct connection with the intellect and even equated with it. And this although the absolutely inactive intelligence, as well as the fully active intellect, are fundamentally independent of each other, as both also correspond to different valences. Accordingly, they also diverge absolutely. Respectively, they strive apart and deviate from each other thoroughly, as they also differ and strive towards completely different values. The storehouse of knowledge, of understanding and reason is intelligence, which can comparatively be equated with a dictionary or encyclopedia, which contains no more and no less than only word concepts and their meaning, which are perceived as purely stored information, but which cannot muster any activity. This means that intelligence serves as a storehouse of words and concepts for the consciously and volitionally more highly developed intellect and reason, and is practically their memory, which, however, has no activity whatsoever, and consequently neither a mental or emotional impulse, nor a behavior or an action can be stimulated, brought about or carried out. And this fact results in the fact that, as a consequence of the absolutely activityless word and concept memory arranged by intellect and reason, no nano-tiny beginning of the tiniest reaction can take place or result from the intelligence. This is in contrast to the intellect. The intellect, which is absolutely highly active on a circumferential level, forms the storehouse or repository of all the countless values of knowledge and development taught, developed and formed by the intellect and reason, which manifest themselves in the intellect as active energy of movement, assertion, ability, action and circumferential energy of use, whereby it is given for the human being in every conceivable relationship in a positive, negative or balanced neutral way that he can comprehend, implement and realize everything through action and activity. And this is possible for him solely through his intellect, which has received all the necessary necessities and prerequisites for this from the development of understanding and reason, and also contains the indispensable active energy of action, which is necessary in order to let everything become reality through deed and action, which is in the human being's mind and will to realize it. The activity assigned to the intellect, which the storage, being intelligence, absolutely lacks, and which therefore only leads an inactive shadow existence as the memory of intellect and reason, enables the human being to act, behave, act and develop in every conceivable possible way in terms of movement and motion. And he is able to do this through the high activity of the intellect, and thereby also to have an evolutionary effect on himself in his inner being, as well as in relation to external developments. Intellectual activity alone enables the human being to further develop his inner and outer positive, negative and balanced neutral impulses, behavior, actions, and his entire mental and physical activity, as well as his evolutionary thought, feeling, psyche developments, etc., as well as to use them to stimulate new learning processes, cognitions, and mental or intellectual evolutionary processes, and thereby to be evolutionary. And this is naturally possible for human beings through the natural drives of the most nano-tiny impulses and their further development. These extremely fine sensations, which arise through intuitive and inspirational inspirations, curiosity, desires, as well as through inner and outer thousandfold impulses and perceptions of the most diverse kinds, become impulses that can be processed mentally and become teaching and instructing functions that are processed mentally or by the mind and reason and become insights and knowledge factors. These gossamer fine, nanotiny impulses cannot as a rule be perceived consciously by human beings, and therefore only when they have become ascertainable and recognizable impulses. For only in this state do they form the corresponding factors for the function of the necessary conscious thought processes. Only through this, then, does the teaching and instructing of understanding and reason become possible, as well as conscious learning from the learning results that arise and emerge from it. In further consequence, the whole of what is learned through understanding and reason is entered and stored in the active intellect, which the human being can then use, comprehend, implement, and realize according to his own will and need, according to his ability and degree of his state of consciousness, and the possibilities given by the intellect. This is precisely because the intellect alone corresponds to the highly active block, which, through the intelligentum, contains within itself all conceivable possibilities that ensure that everything is actively handed over to the active conditioned capacity for action of the human being, and that he can use, comprehend, implement, and effectively realize all the abilities and values that come to him in this way through the intellect. And this is so in contrast to the purely memory-conditioned inactivity of intelligence, which,
as already explained,
corresponds to nothing more than a word and concept memory without energy and power, but only to an activityless memory bank without actionable usability, and accordingly only to an annal, memory and mnemonic factor, etc., without any possibility of becoming active. Intelligence is in truth nothing other than an activityless memory with regard to the acquired knowledge of understanding and reason, which holds no more and no less than only words and concepts that can serve to find certain factors in the intellect, which can then be actively used by the intelligentum or the intelligent being of the human being and comprehended, implemented and realized according to the corresponding values contained in the factors. But what is now to be said further? That relates to the fact that some certain terms must also be explained, which as a rule are completely misunderstood and equally misinterpreted by earthlings. As in the first place the term spirit, for the explanation of which further explanations and explanations are also repetitively necessary in order to be dealt with several times through the study of the matter and to be held in memory. Hence the following in a further way. The word, or rather the term spirit, is time-honored and is used in many ways in the daily use of human beings, in all religions, in psychology and philosophy, etc. But this in no way corresponds to what is presented and explained by the teaching of the Spirit. as a result of the traditional use of the word or concept spirit. It is and has been unavoidable to use this word value also in spiritual teachings, because the human beings of Earth have understood and been able to evaluate something quite specific by it since time immemorial. But time has progressed, and so has the understanding of human beings. Consequently, in the present time of the 21st century, they can be enlightened and expected, especially the students of spiritual science and the learners of the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life, to experience the truth, and teaching of what, according to spiritual science, is to be understood and must be effectively understood by the term spirit. The term spirit, which has been used in various ways in spiritual teaching up to now, cannot and must not be associated in any way with the worldly, religious, philosophical, ideological and psychological explanations and uses, for none of their interpretations and explanations, etc., correspond to what basically emerges from what is taught with spirit in spiritual teaching. The term spirit has hitherto only been used in teaching because it could explain something that human beings have understood by this word value since time immemorial. Although this word value does not designate exactly what it is effectively about. However, since understanding and comprehension have evolved in many human beings up to the present day, especially among students of spiritual science who are no longer deeply delusional about religion, but are turned towards reality and its truth, and they have become much more discerning and knowledgeable with regard to real reality and truth. It should and must now be clearly and openly clarified what is to be understood by spirit in spiritual science, or what it is effectively about. According to the present understanding of the human beings of the earth, it can now be explained that the word spirit, no matter how it has always been used in spiritual teachings, was to be understood solely as the energy of creation, and will of course continue to be understood into the future. The terms spirit energy, spirit consciousness, spirit form, and spirit telepathy, as well as spirit energy and spirit being, etc., etc., always result in the same value without exception, namely, energy of creation. By energy of creation is therefore to be understood the tiny energy part of energy of creation, the seat of which in human beings is inserted in the roof of the midbrain, paired node, collicula superior, and which animates consciousness, the thought-feeling psychic world, and the entire physical body, together with all organs in a creation energetic way. From the terms spirit energy, use of spirit, spirit form and spirit telepathy, as well as spirit energy, spirit consciousness and spirit being, etc., it is always to be understood that the term spirit is used solely to express the energy of creation, but never anything else. Consequently, a spiritual way. Spirit is also not to be understood as a soul, as is still claimed today due to religious misguidance. Soul corresponds to a term that has manifold meanings, depending on the mythical, religious, philosophical or psychological teachings and traditions, in which the term soul is also interpreted according to the corresponding confused belief in imaginary illusory elements, etc. If the so-called soul is considered in today's religious linguistic usage, then due to a lack of understanding that the soul is actually the psyche, it is nevertheless understood that all consciousness-related processes in human beings with regard to their thought, feeling, psychic movements are meant. Only in this sense can the soul be understood as largely synonymous with the term psyche. In this sense, the soul, or the psyche, also embodies the principle of all impulses and processes that are regulative, and also influence and bring about physical processes, such as psychosomatic influences and interactions, etc. With regard to the soul, there are also religious and philosophical concepts beyond what has been explained, whereby these refer to an immaterial and imaginary and thus unreal principle, which is to be confirmed in the human being, or in other individuals, as the bearer of life throughout all time, and is to be understood as the actual identity. In religious delusion, it's also falsely assumed and erroneously advocated that the soul is independent of the body with regard to its existence and consequently immortal, also with regard to physical death. Through this erroneous, false and delusional belief, death is defined as a process of separation of soul and body, whereby as a result of this false doctrine, it is erroneously taught in some traditions that the soul already exists before conception. Subsequently, this heresy continues. It inhabits and directs the body only temporarily, to use it only as a tool. The other delusion is also that the soul is locked up in the human body like in a prison. Various such erroneous teachings also claim that the immortal soul alone constitutes the person and personality, whereby the perishable body is completely unimportant, or only represents a heavy burden and a great obstacle for the soul. In numerous religious dogmas, delusions and myths, fears are evoked and threats made concerning a terrible fate for the soul after the death of the body. If it's fallible in the life of the human being, as for example in Greek mythology, it is called Hades or Hell among Christians, in Islam Jahannam, Hebrew Gehinnom. Apart from all this nonsense, a multitude of religious delusional heresies assume and claim that a transmigration of souls or a reincarnation of souls takes place. That is to say that the soul after the death of a human being is born again and again in different new bodies, and if possible as the same personalities as before. From the 17th century onwards, there was a change in research into the principle of life, following which the completely wrong traditional concept from the knowledge of the ancient philosophers that the soul was the principle of life of all living beings was replaced by a new exposé, which was and still is as confusing as the earlier soul definition. So, in the early modern era, the traditional soul heresy that had survived until then was thrown over and replaced by a new confused doctrine that the spirit controlled the bodily functions of human beings. At the same time, all the scientists responsible in this respect still have not the faintest idea of what really results in a completely natural way, and what actually corresponds fundamentally to the term spirit. Consequently, this false designation does not convey reality and its truth, which is why it also does not guarantee the perception, understanding, and comprehension of what is to be understood as the origin, basic value, and function with regard to the term spirit itself. Effectively, it is even the case that with this, precisely with spirit, completely wrong views and hypotheses or presumptions are conveyed to the human being, and he cannot realize and also understand that, namely, the whole fundamentally corresponds to the energy of creation energy, and that he must think himself into this in every relationship solely and exclusively. Consequently, the wrong term spirit should be discarded and no longer used, but only the correct and true term energy of creation should be used, and as a result of understanding, made a habit. And if this is done, then the correct and true interpretation and implementation of the wrong term spirit results in the following manner from the corresponding values. Spirit is therefore in every case always to be understood as the creative, and thus the pulsating energy of creation, as well as the creative power also pulsating therein, which together are also changeable and accordingly capable of bringing about changes and transformations, as this is also given in all material existence, and thus also in the human being, in the whole of nature, and its fauna and flora, as well as in the whole universe and realm of creation in the absolute. Unfortunately, however, it is not possible for a human being to understand this who has become a slave to a religious, worldly, philosophical, psychological, ideological, studied or self-centered delusion, because he is so dominated by it to the point of impossibility that, firstly, he is not able to think thoroughly about himself and his primordial who, how, what I am, and is therefore also not able to get to know himself. This. While secondly, he is thereby also absolutely incapable of perceiving real reality and its truth. Consequently, thirdly, he is also absolutely incapable of understanding and comprehending something that effectively and really exists outside of his delusion, and is indisputably given by the entire changeable energy of creation. However, all this and all the necessary insights and knowledge in this regard are absolutely impossible for a human being to gain if he is in any way addicted to delusion. Consequently, he is also unable to come to terms with the actual reality and its truth in relation to these facts, and remains a slave to stupidity in this respect. As far as the fact is concerned, however, that in the early modern period of the 17th century, the sole false doctrine originating in antiquity was increasingly rejected and replaced by a new and equally false theory. Consequently, it went down the drain was based on the argument that the soul was not needed to explain the affects and bodily processes. Particular attention was paid to the influence of the philosopher René Descartes, who attributed a soul to human beings, while claiming and misleading that its function was limited to thinking. René Descartes, Latinized Renatus Cartesius, born 31st March 1596 in La Haye-en-Touraine, died 11th February 1650 in Stockholm, was a French philosopher, mathematician, and natural scientist. It is known about Descartes that he strove for complete certainty, which is why, in order to find it, he questioned everything. And that included reality and its truth, and thus also the existence of the world. And I remember that he even expressed himself in such a way that he doubted that he existed at all, as well as that he fundamentally rejected any religious or other belief, and thus also the imaginary God. These facts have also been handed down, although it was also a fact that he made enemies of many, both in his own circles and in the outer circles, in which he was also known as an eccentric. This was because, as a result of their religious sectarianism, they saw his ideas, hypotheses, and doubts as the work of the devil and him as a heretic. That is why he also expressed himself in such a way that he would have been better off becoming a beggar than a philosopher. Nevertheless, he continued and did not let himself be dissuaded from his studies and the false results also by truthful explanations from Svarth, because he was simply stubborn and unteachable in this respect. The fact is that his true and false ideas have been carried into the present day and still occupy the philosophers and natural scientists, etc., whereby I would like to say once again with regard to the philosophers, that an enormous number of their statements and ideas are more than just thoughtless, but effectively ridiculous. What is particularly disastrous about their statements concerning the principle of life is that they deal with it at all, because they have no idea whatsoever about its reality and the only truth it contains. The fact is that all the old, newer and newer philosophers have to this day recognized nothing at all, philosophically, from this subject and its facts. Consequently, they have also been unable to evaluate anything in this respect. And they will not be able to do this in the future either, because this is reserved for specialists who deal with the matter of the energy of creation and its function in the human physique, and therefore with the energy of creation and its forces in the entire body, brain, consciousness, as well as with the structure and logical or logical active process and work of the entire thought-feeling psychic world of the human being. Returning to René Descartes, who ascribed to the human being a soul alone, as well as the fact that this soul is solely responsible for thinking, a debate has been going on ever since in the world of philosophy, etc., about his confused doctrine, which I call the soul-body-life principle problem. Since Descartes, this has continued to this day, and still no human being has become clever enough to get away from the old nonsense doctrines of all philosophers in order to turn to effective reality and its incontrovertible truth. On the contrary, the whole of humanity on earth is still and always has remained with the old-fashioned false and erroneous teachings of the philosophers, because these, the very philosophers, are considered to be supposedly deep thinkers, knowers, and even wise men, which, however, they are not in truth. So, philosophical muddling along is still going on today in the old traditional framework, as a result of which today's object of philosophy continues the nonsense of the old erroneous, false and confused teachings, but only in the use of a new hypothesis and the new concept of spirit, which is now philosophically stupid for investigation. And this is now in the third millennium in the 21st century, the ultimate of all the millennia-old philosophical nonsense. And the fact that even today the entire staff of philosophers on Earth has not even a glimmer of an idea of what they are dealing with is more than just an evolutionary indictment of poverty, as is also the case with the belief in the nonsense of religions, which, it can also be said, arose from early philosophical illusory perceptions, interpretations, deceit, lies, and deception. But the fact that the new philosophical attempt is now concerned with the new concept of spirit, and in particular with the question of the relationship between mental and physical states, is considered modern philosophy, in which a broad spectrum of strongly divergent approaches is discussed. The whole thing is supposed to start from positions that are supposed to be the existence of an independent, bodily independent, soulistic substance, whereby everything is supposed to lead up to eliminative materialism or eliminativism, respectively, which is considered to be the view within the philosophy of spirit. This central thesis is that mental states are nothing other than appearances. Since time immemorial, various philosophers have also nonsensically claimed that statements about mental facts are inappropriate, and that nothing corresponds to them in reality, since all mental states and processes are only apparent, and moreover, completely reducible to the biological. These radical positions also have different moments that, on the one hand, do not deny reality to the mental, but on the other hand, only allow the term soul in a weak sense. Spirit does not correspond to an ancient term, but leads back to late antiquity, whereby this term is roughly distinguished and understood by the human beings of Earth in connection with consciousness between two components of meaning. In this way, Wikipedia elaborates on some things that are indispensable to study in order to understand the term spirit, and also when it may seem unimportant or boring to some human beings. However,
If something,
a thing, a word, a situation or matter, etc.,
wants or needs to be understood to the bottom,
then it is necessary and unavoidable that even that which is not exactly of special interest must be learned and understood, which is now also true with regard to the term spirit, as it is commonly used in an earthly human sense. Therefore, after our conversation, I will look up some informative facts about spirit from Wikipedia and add them as an explanatory appendix to our conversation report.
Origin of the values relating to ethics, ethos, and morality and their misuse.
Through rhetoric or populist vernacular eloquence, the value of the terms ethics, ethos, morals was already established about 9 billion years ago by Nokodemion in his teaching of truth, teaching of spirit, teaching of life, and has been handed down over all billions of years until today. Various human beings on Earth have also given thought and consideration to the same results, which have then also been taught, recorded in writing, and disseminated worldwide as the teachings of morality, ethics, and ethos, and have found their way into the entire block in this respect. The origin of ethos, ethics, and morality on Earth is erroneously attributed to the philosopher Aristotle, who is said to have founded the whole thing as an independent philosophical discipline. But this assertion is just as untrue as it is that the originators were the ancient sophists. In fact, the origin of the values of morality, ethics, and ethos was set 9 billion years ago by Nokodemion, the founder of nations and the original founder of the teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life. He based his teachings on the term ethosias, or wisdom, which is called ethos in abbreviated form. Nokodemion worked out fundamental conventions, or rules of social behavior for all life forms capable of consciousness, understanding, and reason, which also includes the human being, Homo sapiens, and all rational beings in general. These conventions were determined for the individual life form, as well as for communities and groups, as well as for society and peoples, namely as a norm of behavior and validity for good and appropriate social behavior and protection of all life forms capable of consciousness, understanding, and reason, as well as for the protection of all existence with regard to nature and its fauna and flora. These norms created by Nokodemion regarding morality, ethics, ethos, and human rights, etc., were also brought to Earth about 22 million years ago, where, however, in the course of time and millions of years, they were no longer maintained, and therefore also not transferred to the earthly original human beings when they emerged almost simultaneously several times on all continents throughout the Earth about 12 million years ago. Au fait, this is contrary to all the false paleontological claims of earthly researchers that human beings only emerged as dry-nosed primates 2 to 4 million years ago in the south of Africa, and so on. The norms established by Nokodemion with regard to morals, ethics, ethos, etc. became valid for every single life form up to the great mass of all human life forms, whereby the only prerequisite for their use and implementation was to possess a clear consciousness as well as understanding, reason, and a functioning intellect in order to be able to make the norms of behavior valid. All the conventions created by Nokodemion in primeval times and brought to Earth in the course of time and forgotten were, however, brought here again by early Pleiaren some time before antiquity, when other Earth foreigners were also coming and going and had already spread all over the world. Even from these, however, the early Pleiaren kept themselves secret for millions of years, so as not to provoke interplanetary conflicts and also not to let such excesses break into their dimension. So they also held back from the Earth foreigners who ruled in various pre-ancient countries on Earth, such as the Long Skulls, who exercised their might especially in the areas around the Nile and in the southland of the American continent. Later, in the time of antiquity, the philosopher Aristotle, as well as others, came back to the ancient teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, on the basis of a teaching by a Pleiaren sage or itinerant teacher called Fluid Jason, who concealed his origin. Connected with this was also the comprising 77 million canons, whereby he was also made aware by the sage of the canon containing the teaching of the conventions of behavior as created by Nokodemion. From this, Aristotle created what became the moral ethical ethos doctrine, as it also became the sophists, the representatives of a group of Greek philosophers and rhetors or orators who spread their teachings in the 5th to 4th centuries BC. Rhetoricians were also human beings at that time who had mastered a good and already persuasive art of oratory, which was already known as a discipline in Greek antiquity, and was actually nothing other than the origin of populism. And through this art of oratory, human beings were verbally lulled and persuaded for the purpose of what populist speeches were used for, such as, on the one hand, for a philosophical and also religious delusion, but also for influencing political elections and for electing a certain person to office, and so on. In Greek antiquity, rhetoric played a particularly important role in this respect, especially in opinion-forming processes with regard to politics, but also with regard to religious and philosophical delusion. This is also the case today throughout the world, although in modern times the art of oratory has become much more sophisticated, and it has the same, but much more extensive effect, because nowadays populism is also disseminated in various forms through the public media and beguiles the largely uneducated audiences, who unthinkingly defect to the populist speakers and blindly give them their votes. Populism is known in relation to the rhetors or rhetoricians called populists, through whom it has come about that governments are largely misgoverned by populist strongmen. So, just as populism played an important role in ancient Greece in order to win over followers, delusional believers and popular vassals for religions, philosophies and politics who were ignorant and incapable of thinking, deciding, and forming their own opinions, it is being done in the same way today. As was the case then, it is also the task and the might of the rhetoric of the manipulative populist religious and philosophical delusionists to win over believers and listeners. And in the present time of the 21st century, that is to say, of the third millennium, the populist deceptive and deceptive bait and switching in terms of political election campaigning works particularly well because the mind, reason, and intellect of the human beings are atrophying more and more. This is primarily due to the religious sectarian delusion and the associated fear of an alleged divine punishment. When people no longer think delusionally, but rationally, and thus according to reality and truth, which does not permit any erroneous, confused, unrealistic, and irrational religious delusion, which not only has a mind-blinding effect, but also makes the believing human beings dependent, in bondage, unfree, dependent, and humble. Through populist rhetoric in the vernacular, uninitiated listeners are persuasively driven towards something and persuaded to a certain opinion and action by means of statements, assertions, misrepresentations, lies, and slander. This corresponds to an effective fact, which, unfortunately, due to the stupidity of the listeners, is neither recognized nor considered, as a result of which they unthinkingly fall prey to every possible religious nonsense and delusion, as well as to every political lie, misrepresentation, untrue assertion, distortion of facts, and shameless slander. In this way, self-appointed victims will elect their exploiters and torturers into their offices and high positions, where they can then work disastrously without restraint. The task of any populist speech is always, no matter whether religious or philosophical, political, military or otherwise, to convince the listeners of a statement, assertion, lie, slander, or conspiracy theory, to make them obedient and to force them unnoticeably to a certain predetermined opinion and delusional belief, as well as to a certain action. And this is done in a populist manner without the audience noticing this rhetorical manipulation and also not understanding that they are being manipulatively directed and controlled. So the art of oratory or rhetoric provides the means for every uninitiated human being to accept every assertion, theory, hypothesis, slander, and lie as true, if only it is convincing enough or especially populist, be it religious, philosophical, political, or otherwise. The effective fact is that every populist rhetoric is always founded as a double task, namely, the whole thing is supposed to correspond to science on the one hand and credibility on the other. However, without exception, and thus always, it is only a matter of convincing the listening and influenced human beings to a certain view, an opinion, a belief or delusion, as well as to an action or promise, etc., whereby every conviction corresponds to nothing other than persuasion, because this is the decavrated or true character of every conviction. And this is the case in every case, without exception, because everything is always directed in favor of the respective populist person, be it a person who spreads a religious delusion of faith and thus catches and deceives believers, or politicians who want to be elected, or philosophers, scientists, or others who spread their hypotheses or assumptions and presumptions and want to persuade and convince their listeners. The art of oratory, which is actually a skill of speech and rhetoric, is generally misused by the human beings of Earth as a means to dishonest ends, namely as a theory, hypothesis and assumption, whereby lies, deceit and slander are used to persuade and convince fellow human beings, for example, to persuade them to a religious sectarian delusion, for the purpose of politics and to influence elections, etc. Similarly, the populist art of speech is also used to persuade a human being to buy goods, as is done in particular by market criers, etc., to make a profit. But the art of speech is also used in court, etc., for defense or self-defense, gaining an advantage and or to mitigate or exempt from punishment, etc. In particular, populist and indoctrinating rhetoric is used in an abusive sense to lead one or many human beings who are easily influenced, lazy in thinking, incapable of forming their own opinions, generally uneducated in many matters and therefore stupid in this respect, and therefore susceptible to belief and obedience, into error and confusion, and to harmful actions, deeds, and behavior. In the sense of eloquence, that is to say, rhetoric, this has thus been used since antiquity for persuasion in order to populistically maneuver the human beings into a religious belief, a view, a cause, into political decisions and machinations, and so on. Thus, it is in no way a matter of instructing human beings by means of an effectively realistic and truthful teaching, as well as real explanations and of stimulating them to personal thinking, reflection, and rational decision-making, but on the contrary, it is a matter of seducing them to make ill-considered decisions, actions, and behavior, and to accept foreign views and opinions, and to act and behave exactly according to what they are populistically led to believe. And this is so with regard to every religious delusion that religionists of all kinds, such as priests, preachers, higher religious order holders, as well as other effectively fanatical sectarians, spread in a populist manner in order to capture delusional believers who have fallen for them, as is equally common with regard to populist hucksterism, for winning votes in elections and in other sleazy political machinations. As already explained, the populist speech technique, which is also connected with a body language or posture corresponding to the speech, with corresponding body movements, gestures, facial expressions, voice power, and an expressing psychological constitution and mood, was already used in antiquity and even before, by Greek as well as by other philosophers and rhetors. Even then, these used their eloquence to influence and persuade the human beings listening to them, and to get them to faithfully accept the doctrines and false doctrines that were populistically scrounged up in front of them, and to pay homage to the speakers. The religious delusionists were the first to bring false teachings to the human beings of earth, which caused much harm, mischief, and enmity, especially the false teachings of religions and fanatical sectarian delusion, which led to murderous wars and terror among practically all peoples on earth. The philosophers, on the other hand, brought false doctrines concerning the principle of life as well as concerning understanding, reason, intelligentum and intellect, etc., whereby earthliness was led astray and confused, and whereby this catastrophically stupid philosophical trend continues to this day. Apart from the roaring nonsense which many philosophers of all times have brought, and some of them still bring today, it must be conceded to them that diverse teachings concerning ethics, ethos, and morality were the focus of philosophical considerations, and thus brought earth humans a teaching of the greatest and most special value. The ancient philosophers did not devise this valuable teaching themselves, so Aristotle did not either, but they took it over from a Pleiadian itinerant teacher, from a wise man who on the one hand had to conceal his origin, like many others, because the origin of certain earth foreigners was not allowed to be recognized. But on the other hand, he had special knowledge and also mastered the art of argument, of extensive verbal explanations, of explaining and proving, and in this way he spread the traditional teachings of ethics and morality as they were originally worked out and taught by Nokodemion. In this respect, only a few can be mentioned, whereby Socrates, Plato, Thucydides, Pythagoras, Anaxagoras, Parmenides, Heraclitus, and George of Leontinol should perhaps also be mentioned, although I do not know exactly which of these philosophers really dealt in depth with the teaching of ethos, ethics, and morals, as was the case with Aristotle. Apart from those mentioned, there were many other ancient Greek philosophers, of whom I only know a few names, but I would like to mention them and look them up on Wikipedia and then mention them as an appendix after our conversation.
Question from the hypothetical and theoretical perspective of a rational decision.
If I look at ethics and morality from a hypothetical and theoretical point of view, then, from my point of view, the question arises in this regard as to what is rational in relation to how action should and must be taken. However, a hypothetical or theoretical question and decision differs from an ethical question and decision in the way that a decision in hypothetical or theoretical form does not necessarily correspond to good rational action, just as it does not necessarily correspond to something morally valuable good. If I consider that ethical and moral hypotheses and theories, which as a rule make generally binding claims of correctness, differ from rational decisions from hypotheses and theories, however, in that they are as a rule directed solely towards very specific interests and goals, then this is wrong. This is precisely because only these goals are pursued, whereby, however, only that which is oriented towards a certain person, a group, a collective, or a certain object is taken into account. This can also be a country, a particular subject, or a company or a people. I will go on to say that in order to explain the word value morality, commandments can be used as parables, which fundamentally do not correspond to laws, but to recommendations and advice. Such commandments or recommendations were already interpreted by the herald Nokodemion about 9 billion years ago, not in our Dern universe, but in the Ankar universe, and thus in another space-time structure. Nokodemion laid the foundation stone for 77 million canons, with the teaching of the commandments, etc., which were recorded in the Teaching of the Spirit, or Teaching of Truth, Teaching of the Spirit, Teaching of Life, after which the teaching was taught and spread until today through the work of heralds, who also had to fulfill prophetic and predictive tasks on various human-inhabited planets in the Ankar universe, but also in the Daal universe of the twin creation. And since about 22 million years ago, the most distant descendants from the Nokodemion peoples from the Ankar universe came into our Dern universe and settled on Earth. The spiritual teaching or teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, was finally also brought into this space-time structure. About 13,500 years ago, it was determined that the teaching should be brought, taught and spread to the human beings of the earth in sevenfold succession, which then actually also happened 4 times through heralds from the direct Nokodemion spirit lineage in the Middle East. In the process, however, the doctrine founders were always threatened, while the doctrine was disregarded to such an extent that it could not achieve any real success, and neither peace, freedom, harmony, love, nor justice for the peoples could emerge from it. When the 5th herald appeared in the Near East and taught the people, he was betrayed by the religious powers and their followers, threatened with death, and tried to be executed by legionaries, but he survived and fled to India. The persecution and betrayal was carried out by distant descendants of those who, in earlier centuries and millennia, had already threatened 4 preachers with death, disregarded their teachings, and continued to indulge in their delusional belief in an imaginary god. When the 6th herald appeared afterwards and brought the doctrine of truth, doctrine of the spirit, doctrine of life, this time in Arabia today, Saudi Arabia, until the year 632 AD, or after the previous herald, everything was no different than with all the heralds before, namely that the doctrine was also fundamentally falsified this time and has also been preserved in this way until today. So it happened each time that as a result of false personal interpretations of the followers of the teachings, who always became fanatical delusional believers, and through doctrine disrespecters, malicious people, enemies, and scripture experts who falsified the teachings, as well as later commissioned or independently working scripture experts, additional falsifications were created, whereby the basic concept of the teachings completely disappeared. Thus, the true teaching was maliciously falsified several times beyond recognition, and from it a new false teaching was fabricated several times, which is now prevented in modern times in the 7th succession by the fact that the spiritual teaching, or the teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, is written directly from the ground up and in this way, preserved, multiplied, and spread throughout the world. But as far as the parables concerning commandments are concerned, to which I must return again, these correspond to nothing other than a recommendation and advice which can be positively and voluntarily exercised, fulfilled, carried through, and realized in a rational way and with a good conscience. Such commandments or recommendations and advice correspond to both secular, ideological, and religious or other faith-based forms, such as, among others, be peaceful and keep quiet, do right and spare no one, thou shalt not kill, beware and guard against all evil and wickedness.
Ethos as a basic concept of ethics and morality.
The ethoic consciousness and ethos values ethos. The concept of ethos which can basically be explained as the consciousness of all comprehensive moral values, and as the imprinted attitude of the overall attitude of human beings, and thus as their comprehensive basic ethical consciousness, encompasses much more in its entirety than is grasped, understood, and explained by the philosophical and psychological earthly sciences. If these are considered and dissected, then it is clear to see that from an earthly philosophical psychological point of view, the whole of the ethos ethics moral teaching, as created by Nokodemion, has not been understood and is still being spread today in a completely distorted way. In addition to this fact, this teaching has been falsified since ancient times by completely misguided and confused interpretations by know-it-alls, just as it continues to be falsified today, because all those who want to know better think they are smarter than the actual originator of the teaching itself. As the saying goes, the chick always wants to be smarter than the chicken. But this fact will certainly not be recognized by the studied know-it-alls, because they will insist on their doctorates, which are based on hypotheticals or assumptions, and think they are more than all those human beings who live their lives without such lofty titles. So they will insult me as a layman without a title, and continue to persist in their delusion that they know everything better because of their doctorate, precisely because they are students. Consequently, they will continue to falsify the teachings of the Nokodemion, because they do not understand them from the bottom up, indeed cannot understand them at all, because in their obsession with knowledge of faith, they cannot find the way to logic or consistency. Accordingly, their way will be to insult me and stomp me into the ground as an ignorant and unstudied person, in order to make themselves great in front of the people with their titles, and to let them call them knowers. Now, it must be understood that the science of philosophy and psychology, as they were taught and explained by the earlier philosophers, etc., and are also understood and taught by the earthly experts in the present time, are extremely deficient and do not say what corresponds to the values of the ancient teaching as it was created by Nokodemion. What he taught, namely, results in all values of mind, which are founded in themselves as peace, freedom, harmony, justice and righteousness in high quality respectability, which determine the human being's ethics and morals, which result especially from the basic concept of ethos as follows. According to the teachings of Nokodemion, the concept of ethos, the wise or wisdom, is related as the main and primary concept to everything and every existing thing, and is therefore also fundamentally to be understood as the consciousness of all comprehensive moral values, and as the imprinted attitude of the overall attitude of human beings. In addition, the ancient ethos teaching of Nokodemion teaches that ethos as the basic concept of ethics and morality contains and determines all those values that are brought to bear through ethics and morality. This means that without the basic values of ethos, neither ethics nor morality can exist or be applied. As far as the ethos doctrine, ethics doctrine, and morality doctrine are concerned, as these have been spread and taught by the earthly philosophical doctrines since time immemorial, it is to be strictly noted that in this respect, according to Nokodemion, who was the originator of the primordial ethos ethics moral doctrine, the earthly philosophical interpretations, expositions, explanations and doctrinal moments regarding the definition of ethos and ethics and morality have been wrongly analyzed, evaluated and characterized, substantiated, presented and interpreted since time immemorial. Thus ethos, or wisdom, is to be explained as a comprehensive ethological consciousness, which encompasses much more than is grasped, understood and explained by the philosophical and psychological earthly sciences. So it is to be understood that the philosophical and psychological sciences were taught insufficiently and partly also wrongly by the earlier philosophers, etc., as a result of their lack of understanding with regard to the ethos ethics moral teaching of Nokodemion. It is a fact, therefore, that this teaching, which is also partly misunderstood and partly mistaught by the earthly experts of today, is extremely deficient and does not say what corresponds to the values of the ancient ethos ethics moral teaching as it was created by Nokodemion. What he taught, in fact, results in the following. In a broader sense, the term ethos must be understood to mean the reasoning and logic or consistency of all forms of expression possible and determined for human beings of their thought, feeling, psychic movements, as well as their modes of action and behavior. This includes all forms of expression and characteristics that are used by human beings and also determine their moral attitude or ethics and the way they are carried out, as well as their practice and implementation as moral values. In this respect and in this way, all high values are to be understood in the main, which are named from the teaching of Nokodemion as follows from the basic concept block of the very broad value definitions in relation to the ethos value content. Listed as a list, these ethos values include all necessary factors to ensure existence in a humane form, whereby at least the bulk of these values shall be listed here, although I do not claim to comprehensively name all values. Some more about the difference between ethos, ethics, and morality. Ethos corresponds to moral values, to an attitude created by consciousness, or to an overall attitude of morality which corresponds to ethical consciousness. The higher the value of the ethos is, or the more comprehensive the individual, very diverse factors of attitude are, the higher the character and thus the ethical behavior is formed, so that a high ethos also determines a high ethical or strong character action and behavior of the human being. According to Nokodemion, the creator of the ethos ethics moral doctrine, ethos in its comprehensive value corresponds to a collection of templates in relation to attitude factors, which convey moral values shaped by consciousness as ethical consciousness, which are elaborated into character values and implemented and realized as ethics in the sense of the totality of moral norms and maxims. All these values correspond to a responsible attitude of the human being, insofar as he appropriates, comprehends, and realizes them. If this is the case, then ethos corresponds to the basic substance for the formation of ethics, and this in turn for the comprehension or realization and fulfillment of morality, whereby morality is exercised and comprehended through character-formed morality and the sense of duty and obligation, as well as through loyalty to duty and the sense of responsibility. The ethos preliminarily basically forms the individual factors that shape the ethical character, which, if they are used, formed and worked out into a character value, become a habit of life. Ethics as a moral discipline is founded in ethos and also conveys a convention for critically reflecting on or examining everything and thinking about it comparatively. The ethos corresponds to a value factor block of very diverse characteristics and qualities, which are indispensable as basic factors for the formation of character, and, according to this, determine ethics or ethical consciousness. This, in turn, is not only decisive for the behavior of individual human beings, but also for the entire ethos ethics moral structure of society and humanity as a whole. As the last form of transformation from ethos, morality emerges via ethics, which is expressed as a moral way of behavior and also determined for the entire social institutions, objectively as custom and subjectively as character. The very diverse and learnable high-quality basic factors of ethos, which are indispensable for character formation, also fundamentally determine and constitute or organize the unity of every social community and stabilize it, although they also delimit other communities. The terms ethics and morals are not the same, but they are synonyms for correct behavior. Morality means custom or rule, which provides human beings with a concrete framework for appropriate behavior. A moral concept in itself, however, does not necessarily mean that the human being must also act according to the given rules, etc. Because in principle, personal opinion, freedom of decision and action, and thus freedom of behavior with regard to how, when, and whether, apply in every case. Ethics means character, and in contrast to morality, it is not about a code of conduct as such, but about the analysis of various moral concepts that derive from ethos, from which extremely comprehensive values emerge, according to which the human being can form his character and build up his moral norms according to this, and comprehend and realize these as morality or moral action. In this way, ethics can be described as a kind of moral science. In addition to the basic morality as created by Nokodemion, many other morals exist, such as in religions, politics and justice, as well as in moral theology, moral psychology and moral sociology, etc. fundamentally. However, with regard to the concept of ethics, there can only be one morality, no matter how many subspecies are made of it, and how different they are according to the resulting species. In this way, the whole thing can be roughly compared to the diversity of species. Although there are dozens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, or even millions of different species of any living thing, there is only one genus of each species of a particular life form. And this is also so with regard to ethics, which has absolutely only the one single primordial form corresponding to moral consciousness, as this is fixed by the teaching of Nokodemion. Therefore, there can also be only one ethical teaching, and this also when so-called researchers, philosophers, and scientists erroneously and confusedly arrive at different results. Basically, in spite of their nonsensical differences, they all have to come to terms with the background and the teaching of ethos, ethics, and morality, and they have to do so in the way that everything is given by Nokodemion. And the fact that the army of researchers, philosophers and scientists are all making up nonsensical nonsense and making nonsensical assumptions contrary to the effective ethos, ethics, moral teachings and defining everything completely wrongly shows only a picture of know-it-allism and arrogance, of megalomania and lack of insight. The ethos, ethics, moral doctrine has, after all, been mainly at home in philosophy since the time of Aristotle, and has since led to unbelievably stupid assertions, false doctrines, and to beguilingly stupid blossoms that provide clear proofs, and whose enough that hardly anything true is left of what was brought by the ethos, ethics, moral doctrine of the original doctrine. As far as ethos alone is concerned, it must be said that in modern times it is no longer known at all what a large number of determining and important factors of attitude are contained in it, and what decisive significance and importance they have. But even in Aristotle's time, these values were suppressed by him because he was not able to process them, and therefore simply did not include them in his work of thought. Morality corresponds to the practical application of ethics or the moral disposition arising from ethos. Every morally exact and correct verbal utterance, declaration, rebuke, and rhetoric, no matter in which soft or loud tone it's presented, can only be correct, just, and correct. And this is also true of every action and behavior that conforms to basic moral values. In principle, effective morality is to be understood as a system of norms of verbally correct rhetoric and morally correct actions and behavior, which should in principle be valid for every single human being. Unfortunately, however, it is the case that the majority of earthly humanity neither knows, learns, nor follows the ethos, ethics, moral teaching, as a result of which unkindness and all kinds of hatred prevail worldwide, such as discord, disharmony, injustice, unrighteousness, as a result of which wars, terrorism, and crimes are the order of the day. In this, the delusion of God plays the most powerful and gruesome role. For all delusion preaches love, peace, freedom, and justice. But at every opportunity, the delusionists flip out and murder other delusionists or adversaries, etc., when they feel wronged or insulted. As soon as a louse crawls over their liver, they go crazy and fall prey to enmity, hatred, murder, and manslaughter, and all evil, up to and including war and terror. In contrast to subjective judgment, for example with regard to wealth, title, or reputation, etc., truthfully correct, valuable, and humane morals should in principle apply to all human beings. But unfortunately, this is not the case with Earth humans. This is because the majority is addicted to religious delusions and is not willing to turn to reality and its incontrovertible truth, which is oriented towards love, peace, harmony, justice, and righteousness, as well as the equality of all human beings. The result is that Earth humans have the most diverse systems of norms, which logically also have different morals, although these types of morals are completely alien to creation, murderous and destructive, and bring much suffering and countless deaths to Earth humans. Overall, the fulfillment of ethos is understood to mean the moral attitude of human beings. Although this understanding, according to the ethos taught by Nokodemion, does not correspond to everything that emerges from his ethos teaching. This is extended to the thought, feeling, psychic world of the human being. Just as the personal, far-reaching ethos of a human being or a person also refers to every interpersonal relationship, to every family, friendship, acquaintance, every community, worldly grouping, special social group, every learning or school community, etc., and must be understood as all-embracing. This also includes the whole of nature and its fauna and flora, and practically everything that exists, which means that nothing can be excluded from the ethos. Ethos is about the only positively and valuably founded basic values, which are brought to bear and expressed in ethics and morality, whereby they are formed as pure, powerful thoughts emanating from consciousness and feelings resulting from them as high moral values. These in turn correspond in the sense of ethos or wisdom to a pure, positive, honorable attitude and overall attitude, and thus to ethical consciousness. In the sense of a holistic attitude and perception, this is consciously oriented towards the responsible cultivation of all moral norms and maxims or attitudes, guiding principles, mottos, rules, and modes of behavior in a positive, good way and with high values, as these underlie the ethos. The concept of ethos, as taught by Isobron, corresponds to the behavior of consciousness with regard to moral values, which form and express the ethical consciousness as an imprinted attitude and overall attitude, which is then followed and realized through the application of morality. A high ethos also determines a high and just legal consciousness, as well as correct and righteous ethical and moral action. If the philosophical concept of ethos is considered and defined in detail, then for the human being as an individual, it designates and signifies in advance his or her honorable habit of life that shapes him or her, as well as his or her honorable principle of conduct in life. Ethos as a philosophical discipline establishes and determines for the righteous and responsible human being the ancient critical reflection of the comprehensive high values of ethos, which are lived out and brought to bear through ethics and morality. The high values of ethos stand not only as the basis for the ethical and moral behavior of the individual human being, but also for the entire structure of human behavior, as well as for the equally comprehensive values that must also apply to every social institution in which he lives. Objectively, this means that the human being should subjectively lead his life as a firm of character, morality, and morals in the entire environment. Effectively, it is only through the values of ethos and the practice of the morality that emerge and are realized. From them, that the unity is created for a personal generation with regard to a healthy and righteous personal self-recognition without shame and disgrace. Only this makes it possible for the human being to unite in an effectively peaceful, harmonious, free, loving and honest, unifying, righteous and integral way with one or more other human beings without any problems, or to constitute and stabilize himself in a certain social community, as well as to separate and exclude himself from other unequal communities of any kind that are harmful to him or to other human beings.
Excuse me for interrupting you because I think it is necessary. Well, I think I can understand you and what you are saying. But we must certainly bear in mind that everything must have its correctness. Otherwise, the whole thing would not have been arranged by the level Arahat Atharsata in the way it has come about and is now. As you know, dear friend, early ancestors of Eupleiaran emigrated to this earth, and many of them also died here on this planet, as a result of which their forms of creation or their spirit forms have since reincarnated again and again on Earth in new personalities. And this is still the case today and tomorrow, as well as the day after tomorrow and in the far future, because for the earlier emigrants from the Ankar universe or space-time structure, precisely for the Pleiaran emigrants at that time, it was determined that their distant and most distant descendants should be taught until far into the future with regard to the teaching of truth, teaching of the energy of creation, teaching of life. This is also how it was recorded in the memory bank of Nokodemion. As I explained to you, your daughter Sim Yase, and also Quetzal and Asket, when you all asked me about what was basically the origin and purpose of our contacts, about which you all did not have any complete information. From my personal point of view, however, I find that not only the earthbound descendant personalities of the ancient Pleiaran need the teaching of truth, teaching of the energy of creation, teaching of life, but also all earthlings. This is especially so, for when I see how bad and terrible and evil-minded the majority of earthlings are, how they are dominated by an immense amount of misery, hatred, vindictiveness, discord, unfreedom, disharmony and war, by murder, manslaughter and terror, as well as by criminality, crime, lack of honor and dignity, by dishonesty, vices, greed, unkindness, malice and falsehood, etc., then I cannot help but feel that they are in need of the teaching of truth. Then I cannot help but also strive for this humanity by also striving for it to bring and spread the teaching. For this I have no reward, which I do not want anyway, but I am left with the hope that one or two human beings on Earth will nevertheless take up an iota of the teaching, think about it, and find the way to then also really learn and follow the teaching in order to make a true human being out of themselves. Now, because I have access to the memory bank of Nokodemion as a result of my Nokodemion lineage, in which all information is contained without exception, which also applies to all successor personalities, determined by the energy form of creation up to the present day and into the future. It was and is always possible for me to search for and find everything necessary in the memory bank of Nokodemion. Through this, during one of my last visits to you on Era, I was also able to make an effort with regard to the metal sphere image, and find out that it is a large and ancient library, which also contains the entire OM canon work. But since you were forbidden to open this spherical library by force, which you could not have done, even by force, I searched for the sign in the memory bank and was then able to tell you how you could open the structure.